Leonard "Lenny" Doyle built an empire from the shadows of East London. Patrick and Sean Mercer ruled its streets with iron fists, and Daniel the Vulture Kane circled above, waiting for the moment to strike. Three names that turned British gangland into a bloody game where only one would survive. In the smoky back streets of East London during the late 1980s, Leonard "Lenny" Doyle's name was barely known beyond a few back alley card games and police reports of pickpocketing. He had grown up in a crumbling council estate, the kind of place where opportunity meant choosing between crime or disappearing into obscurity. Lenny chose crime, but not in the loud, chaotic way of the street thugs around him. He was deliberate, observant, and careful to never leave behind the kind of evidence that would put him in a cell. His rise began with small thefts, slipping wallets from distracted commuters, selling stolen watches to shady pawnbrokers, and quietly learning which fences could be trusted. By the time he was in his early 20s, Lenny understood that petty crime would never make him rich. The real money was in organized operations, jobs that required planning, timing, and trusted people. He started recruiting small crews for quick, targeted heists: a jewelry store with a faulty alarm system, a cash van driver who had a habit of taking the same road home, an electronics warehouse with lazy overnight security. Each operation was completed with precision, and each success added to his reputation. People began to see Lenny not as a street criminal, but as a strategist who could turn chaos into profit. The turning point came when he crossed paths with the Mercer brothers, Patrick and Sean. They were already known in the underworld for their control over the illegal arms trade south of the River Thames. Where Lenny had caution and intelligence, the Mercers had muscle and connections to suppliers in Eastern Europe. The partnership was mutually beneficial. The brothers provided the firepower and protection, while Lenny managed the logistics, making sure their shipments moved undetected and their money was laundered through layers of shell businesses. Their empire grew fast. They bought into nightclubs where cash could be moved without questions, took over gambling dens in rundown neighborhoods, and offered protection to local businesses, protection from trouble that the Mercers themselves often created. Competitors were either bought out or intimidated into disappearing. When persuasion failed, more violent methods were used, though Lenny himself never pulled the trigger. He understood that the less his face was connected to the violence, the harder it would be for police to tie him to anything. The streets began to whisper about Lenny Doyle, the man who could make problems vanish with a phone call. He became a figure people feared without ever really seeing. His public appearances were rare. Most of his orders came through lieutenants who swore loyalty to him. That secrecy became part of his power. Rivals knew the Mercers were dangerous, but they understood that Lenny was the one pulling strings, deciding who made money and who didn't. With the cash pouring in, Lenny surrounded himself with luxury, though never in ways that drew too much attention. Expensive suits, but no flashy cars. Discreet penthouses with hidden safes and private entrances. He entertained only a small circle of trusted people, always suspicious of newcomers. In his mind, survival in the criminal world depended on staying one step ahead of both rivals and the law. But success bred enemies. There were older crews who resented a young outsider taking over territory they had controlled for decades. There were ambitious small-time criminals who dreamed of taking his place. Even within his own circle, there were whispers of discontent from those who wanted more than Lenny was willing to give. For the moment, his control was firm, but in British gangland, power never stayed in one pair of hands for long. The same intelligence and cunning that had lifted Lenny to the top would soon be tested in ways he couldn't predict, and the first cracks in his empire were already forming, hidden in the shadows he thought he had mastered. By the early 1990s, the Mercer brothers had become both the backbone and the weak point of Lenny Doyle's empire. Patrick was the older and more calculated of the two, a man who understood when to keep quiet and when to let fear do the talking. Sean, on the other hand, had none of his brother's restraint. He wore gold watches so heavy they left marks on his wrist, arrived at nightclubs in flashy imported cars, and tossed money around as if it could never run out. The excess drew attention attention, and attention was the one thing Lenny had always avoided. It didn't take long for Scotland Yard's organized crime unit to notice the Mercers. Surveillance teams began tracking their movements, collecting photographs, and listening in on phone calls through hidden wires. At first, these operations yielded little, but the brothers' arrogance grew. They began pushing shipments through riskier channels, trusting their reputation to keep people silent. That arrogance proved costly. A container full of unregistered pistols was intercepted in the docks, its contents plastered across the evening news as evidence of a growing arms crisis in London. Pressure from law enforcement mounted. Detectives began picking off smaller members of the crew, offering reduced sentences in exchange for information. Most stayed loyal, but the very fact that police were asking questions shook the network's confidence. Lenny tried to steady the ship, moving more operations underground and cutting off vulnerable links, but then came the night at the abandoned dock, a meeting that would change everything. Patrick had arranged an arms deal with a new buyer, a man claiming to have deep pockets and even deeper connections in the Middle East. The deal was meant to be quick, a quiet handover, a handshake and a fortune in cash. Instead, it ended in gunfire. Patrick was found sprawled across the cold concrete, 2 bullet wounds in his chest. The cash was gone and the weapons had vanished. The official story was that a rival gang had moved in on the deal, but those close to the inner circle whispered that the shooting had been an inside job. Someone wanted Patrick out of the way. Sean's reaction was immediate and chaotic. He vanished from sight, leaving behind safe houses and businesses he once boasted about owning. Some said he fled to Spain, others claimed he was hiding in the countryside under a false name. Either way, he left Lenny to deal with the fallout. Without the brothers, the empire was unbalanced. Their contacts in the arms trade dried up, and the fear they inspired in rivals began to fade. It was during this time that predators from outside the city sensed weakness. Gangs from Birmingham and Manchester began moving in, testing boundaries with small raids and violent intimidation. Turf that had been firmly under Lenny's control became contested ground, with late-night shootings and mysterious fires breaking out across the city. The police, already watching closely, took the chaos as an opportunity to strike harder. Raids became more frequent, businesses were shut down, and key warehouses were seized. For the first time in years, Lenny felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The well-oiled machine he had built was starting to break down, piece by piece. Trust among his remaining crew was fragile. Every loss, every failed shipment, every rumor about Patrick's death chipped away at his authority. And though Lenny didn't yet know it, another figure was already circling his empire like a vulture, waiting for the right moment to strike. The fall of the Mercers was not just a personal blow. It was the first domino in a chain of events that would push Lenny to the edge of survival. Into the power vacuum left by the Mercers' disappearance stepped Daniel Kane, a man whose presence in the underworld was as unsettling as it was inevitable. Known by his street name, the Vulture, Kane had built his career by feeding on the remains of collapsing empire. He never wasted resources fighting strong, established organizations. Instead, he waited for them to show weakness, then moved in with precision, dismantling them from the inside until nothing was left but scraps. Lenny Doyle's crumbling network was the perfect target. Kane's background was shrouded in rumor. Some claimed he had started as a debt collector for an Irish crime syndicate. Others said he had been a fixer for corrupt businessmen in London's financial district. What everyone agreed on was his method. Kane rarely relied on brute force. He preferred psychological warfare, turning trusted allies into traitors, using bribes to buy loyalty and planting seeds of paranoia until his enemies made mistakes on their own. It was a slow, methodical style of takeover, and it made him far more dangerous than the loud, violent rivals Lenny had dealt with before. The first sign of Kane's presence came quietly. A supplier Lenny had worked with for years suddenly began offering better prices and faster deliveries to another crew. That crew, as it turned out, was working for Kane. Then one of Lenny's safe houses was raided executed by police just hours after he had moved sensitive shipments there. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. Someone inside his own ranks was feeding information to the Vulture. Kane moved like a shadow, striking where Lenny was weakest. He offered better deals to distributors, cutting into Lenny's profit. He convinced club owners and gambling operators to switch allegiance, promising them both higher earnings and police protection. Within months, a large portion of Lenny's network had flipped sides without a single public confrontation. Kane's reach extended beyond the streets. Rumors suggested he had officers in Scotland Yard on his payroll, ensuring his businesses ran untouched while rivals like Lenny were suffocated by constant raids. The more Kane advanced, the more isolated Lenny became. Trusted lieutenants began disappearing, some vanishing entirely, others reappearing under Kane's flag. Even Lenny's own financial channels were infiltrated. Accounts he had used for years to launder money were suddenly frozen, and fronts he had painstakingly built were shuttered under anonymous complaints to authorities. Kane didn't just want Lenny's territory, he wanted to erase him from the map completely. The paranoia began to eat away at Lenny's ability to lead. He stopped attending meetings in person, relying instead on intermediaries he wasn't even sure he could trust. His once flawless planning turned cautious and erratic. Every time he tried to strike back, whether through reclaiming suppliers or disrupting Kane's shipments, his moves were anticipated and countered before they even took effect. It was as if Kane could read his thoughts. In truth, Kane's advantage came from a single devastating fact. He had someone high up in Lenny's inner circle feeding him every detail. The betrayal was deep enough that Kane not only knew Lenny's current operations, but also his contingency plans, safehouse locations, and escape. It was a chess game in which every piece Lenny moved was already trapped. By the time the scale of Kane's infiltration became clear, it was already too late. Lenny's empire, once feared across East London, had been reduced to a handful of loyal men in a shrinking patch of terror. Kane had taken everything else without firing a shot. But the Vulture was not finished. He never left his prey alive once it was crippled, and as Lenny would soon learn, Kane's final move would be both swift and irreversible. By 1995, Lenny Doyle was no longer the figure who had once commanded an empire from the shadows of East London. The network he had built through years of calculated moves and ruthless efficiency was now scattered fragments, most of it absorbed by Daniel the Vulture. Lenny lived like a hunted animal, constantly shifting between dingy flats under false names, never sleeping in the same place 2 nights in a row. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by cheap jackets and worn shoes. He carried only what he could move quickly, a few thousand in cash, a fake passport, and a revolver he hoped he'd never have to use. He had one last lifeline, a hidden stash of cash and documents from the height of his reign, locked away in a disused warehouse near the dock. It was his contingency for a clean escape, a way to disappear overseas, maybe to Spain or South America, and live out the rest of his life, far from the streets that had turned on him. Weeks of paranoia had led him to believe that Kane's attention might have shifted to new rivals, giving him a small window to retrieve it. On a cold, rainy October night, Lenny made his move. The streets were slick with water, the air heavy with the smell of diesel and salt from the river. He kept to side roads and alleyways, his hood pulled low to hide his face. The warehouse stood alone at the edge of the docklands, its rusted metal doors sagging on their hinges. For a moment it seemed undisturbed, just another forgotten piece of the city. Inside, the air was stale and damp. Lenny's footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as he moved toward the hidden compartment where the stash was buried beneath old crates. But before he could reach it, the lights flickered on, blinding in the gloom. Shapes emerged from the shadows, 2 masked men standing perfectly still, blocking the only exit, and then came the third figure stepping forward into the light. Daniel Kane. The Vulture's expression was unreadable, but the message was clear. He had been waiting not just for this moment, but for Lenny to make the mistake of coming out of hiding. This wasn't a raid or a robbery, it was an execution. Kane didn't speak, he didn't need to. The sound of boots scraping against wet concrete filled the silence as the masked men closed in. The first gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, followed by another and then a third. Lenny staggered, the revolver slipping from his grip before he could even raise it. He fell hard, his hand instinctively reaching for the floor, smearing a trail of blood across the cold concrete.
Kane turned without looking back and the masked men followed. Within moments, the warehouse was silent again, save for the soft patter of rain against the roof. By morning, the warehouse was empty. There was no body, no weapon, no sign that anyone had been there at all, only a faint trail of blood leading toward the river. The police never opened a serious investigation. To them, Lenny Doyle was just another ghost in the long history of gangland disappearance. In the weeks that followed, Kane's control of East London became absolute. Businesses that had once paid Lenny's men now answered to Kane. Suppliers who had feared retribution from Doyle's crew found themselves under new, more profitable contracts. The newspapers called it the end of an era, but in reality, it was simply the next turn in the endless cycle of British gangland. Names rose and names fell, and the streets didn't mourn. In back rooms and alleyways, new deals were already being made, and somewhere out there, another ambitious figure was waiting for the moment when Kane himself would show weakness. In that world, the only certainty was that every king eventually met the river.